Good evening, everybody. Hell's Unicorn here again, and tonight I'm actually going to be discussing the topic of liberalism. And I know this has been a subject among others in many videos that I've done in the past. In this one, I'm going to be focusing in on a particular part of it, and my principal inspiration for this little talk was a video put up by Nicotine2, a user that I'm pretty much, for the most part, not particularly fond of. I think he is pretty well my antithesis, if for no other reason than the fact that when he does videos, just from a stylistic standpoint, he always talks as though he is teaching something that he is I guess you could just say, sort of a undisputed master of. Like, he is the ultimate craftsman, and you are just lucky enough to be there watching. It might not be even intentional on his part, but that's just the way he comes across, and it's probably more of the vocal inflection that he tends to have, and the fact that he tends to look up and almost kind of look to the side, almost in sort of a smug fashion. And I think that this kind of underscores the overall problem with the ideology that he comes from and that he is apologizing for in this video. And the truth is I should probably not so much say he's apologizing for it as he's trying to make some sense of it and then apologize for whatever bit of sense he can make of it. But long story short, the crux of his video was a reflection on the two rallies that preceded the midterm elections, one being the Glenn Beck Restoring Honor rally versus the Jon Stewart Restoring Sanity rally. And he had the distinction of essentially attending both rallies. I had the distinction of attending neither of them because I didn't really have a vested interest in either rally per se, although I am somewhat more sympathetic to Beck's crowd on an ideological level. Essentially, he made the point that liberalism, which, let's just get down to brass tacks. What he's talking about when he says liberalism, and what I'm talking about also, is the current socio-progressive slash collectivist politics movement, at least collectivist from a economic standpoint. And he essentially did a bit of a reflection earlier on modern art and how it's mostly a satirical art form, and how left-wing politics has largely taken on this persona, if you will. It's basically become sort of an art of mockery more than an art of ideas, and that it seems essentially out of ideas, if it really had any, in the lead up to this election. And I think the point he was trying to make is that the movement that he is speaking for is in a state of decline. I would argue that it's actually been in a state of decline for the better part of about, I'd say, 150 years, which is about how far back you'd have to go to trace the roots of his variant of it. The truth is that this way of thinking does go back much further, probably perhaps even as far back as ancient civilization, but this particular strand of it is a relatively new concept. It's been around for about 150, 160 years, and it essentially is I would say, almost sort of the counter-bourgeois movement. I'm not going to call it proletarian in nature because it's not really wholly proletariat. It's essentially a bunch of upper-class stoner kids who think that they are of some sort of a higher moral standing because they have the audacity to even care about those less fortunate than them, not really knowing while doing so that a lot of the people that are less fortunate than them are also utterly opposed to what they stand for. But to just put this in the most simplest terms, he argues that the reason why this decline has happened is because the left has gone into a state of total mockery and parody and satire, in which they spend all of their time mocking the conservative movement, or I would argue, the preservation movement. I would say that I'm trying to preserve certain changes that were made previously that I think were good and should stay in effect. But I would assert, as a point of contrast, that this has always been what progressive politics and liberal politics from his standpoint has been about. It's always been a mockery, not just a mockery in the sense that it mocks what it deems as its opposition, but that it essentially is unto itself a mockery. It essentially builds its core around the idea of being against something. He alluded to this, but he alluded to it from the standpoint that it was something that had been a recent phenomenon, that this was something that it got into, when in truth this is something that the counterculture has already been about. I mean, look at the term counterculture within itself. It is a culture in opposition to an established culture. And so I have a hard time taking seriously the assertion that this movement, which is founded on being in opposition to something, can actually essentially claim to stand for something. And I have yet to see anything that this movement can stand for other than being the unknowing and unwitting patsies of people with much less savory intentions. I think that these people might have the best of intentions. They've just come to the conclusion that the intentions of people like me are mistaken, and that they've somehow gotten into their mind that because that we of the paleoconservative slash libertarian persuasion are more sure of ourselves, that we are hence crazy because we've convinced ourselves wholly and completely that the wrong idea is the right idea. And I would say, as a point of contrast, that that is not the case. I would state that conservative politics, at least as I would define it, is essentially the true and right way to do things. It's the way that you come about to this so-called utilitarian society that Nicotine 2 claims that he wants, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. I don't approach politics from that standpoint because that has a built-in scapegoating system in order to establish its ends. I think that not everybody is going to attain to the same level of happiness, but I do think that everyone can attain to a desirable level of happiness if they have been liberated not only from economic constraint, but also from constraint upon their conscience. And I would differ with him in the sense that he would argue that we have to establish a sort of libertarian free will in which we are freed from the bondage of tradition. I would argue, as a point of contrast, that true liberty comes about when we understand our own nature and why the traditions that we have are in perfect harmony with that nature. We are by nature a people, I would say, just speaking about people in general, that, essentially aspire to the same things. And while we may not necessarily have the same means of getting there, we should be afforded the liberty to pursue that. And I would argue in many specific instances that liberty necessitates a separation. And so I have no problem, for example, like he used the argument of anti-racism. I have no problem whatsoever with racial segregation done on a voluntary basis based on volition. If black people decide, as the majority of them tend to, that they want to live only around their own people, I see no reason whatsoever to interfere with that. I myself tend to prefer to be around a certain type of people. They're not necessarily of a certain racial makeup, but they tend to be of a similar intellectual makeup, and for the most part, with a few exceptions, a certain theological persuasion. I think that's a good and natural thing, and I think that progressive politics has this really misguided idea that we can all come together on everything and we can all essentially mix together in sort of a melting pot fashion and essentially all be happy. And I would argue that people are not naturally wired that way, and that people, even when you attempt to rewire them that way, you're not going to come up with positive results. I'm not arguing, for example, from a standpoint of morality, that there is an ought that is to be achieved from the way things naturally are. I'm simply stating that you ought not interfere with what is already established if you cannot get positive results from it. And we have a long and rather unfortunate history proving time and time again that when people with radically different cultural ideas are put within close proximity of each other, that you get negative results. It's just simply the way it is. But I'm kind of getting a bit off topic with that, but just to get back to the original focus of this, nicotine too has come to something of a crossroads, and I think this has been brought about largely because of the recent elections and the ramifications that it has had for this country's ideology. And it's basically that the progressive movement has to come up with something that they stand for, something that they believe in. And Nietzsche essentially came to this crossroads with his idea of an alternative to the established dogmas of Christianity and Christian society. Now the problem is that he never got around to actually fully and completely defining what that alternative is. He just said there ought to be an alternative, and he laid out all the counterpoints which he would argue, and then after that he died of insanity. But I think the ultimate lesson to be taken from that is that there is nothing to stand for in progressive politics. That's not the nature of progressive politics. Progressive politics is by nature parasitic. It feeds off not only of the wealth of those people who hold to a more traditionalistic system of economics, but it also feeds off of the culture that it's mocking, because without that culture it has nothing to mock. And I will assert that absent a culture with established traditions and dogmas, that liberalism and or socio-progressivism would die a woeful death, like the withering on the vine of certain kinds of fruit when the water has dried up. Let's just think about this. What movement that is based wholly on mockery and satire can survive without that which is the subject of its derision? It's pretty much a clear-cut case as far as I see it. I think that progressive politics is only allowed to survive because people like me, who don't have the same level of resolve as I do, simply tolerate its existence rather than fighting it openly, challenging it ideologically, and saying, no, you're wrong completely. Life is not just about mocking tradition, it's about understanding tradition and finding your own way of fitting into that established tradition, because it's there for a very specific purpose. But anyway, just to sum this whole point up, if anybody could even attempt to come up with an answer to this question of can the progressive movement come up with something that it can actually value and something that it can stand for, I would say that nicotine too would be that person. And if and when he does attempt to provide that answer, I will be looking on in a very interested and curious fashion, because if he is successful, he will be the first person in the history of progressive politics to actually do it. Well, something to think about. Prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you. Good evening.